My fiance, Emily, and I had always been drawn to the wild, untamed corners of the Pacific Northwest. We lived in a small town just outside Portland, Oregon, surrounded by dense forests, jagged mountains, and endless hiking trails. Our jobs, hers as a graphic designer, mine as a high school history teacher, kept us tethered to screens and schedules all week, so escaping into nature on weekends was our lifeline. We'd tackled dozens of trails over the years, from the misty cliffs of the Columbia River Gorge to the shadowy depths of Mount Hood National Forest. But nothing prepared us for what happened on that trip in late October, when the air was crisp and the leaves burned red and gold. It was a Friday afternoon when we decided to try a new spot, a 5-mile loop called Ravens Hollow, tucked deep in the forest about an hour's drive from home. We'd heard about it from a coworker of mine, a grizzled guy named Tom who'd grown up in the area. He'd mentioned it offhand, saying it was quiet, secluded, and perfect for camping, though he'd added with a smirk, "Just don't listen to the old stories." When I pressed him, he shrugged and said something about loggers disappearing back in the 70s, but I figured it was just small-town folklore meant to spook city folks like us. The trail had decent reviews online, mostly from hikers praising the views and the solitude. So we packed our gear, loaded up my beat-up Jeep, and hit the road. The drive was peaceful at first, winding through towering evergreens as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the asphalt. But about 20 minutes from the trailhead, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the road and forcing me to slow to a crawl. Emily fiddled with the radio, but all we got was static, typical for these parts. By the time we pulled up to the gravel lot at the trailhead, the fog had thinned, but a light drizzle had taken its place. There was one other vehicle parked there, an old rusted pickup truck with a faded bumper sticker that read, "Keep Oregon Weird." It looked like it hadn't moved in days, with mud caked on the tires and a thin layer of pine needles dusting the hood. "Guess we're not totally alone," Emily said, peering out the window as she zipped up her rain jacket. I nodded, scanning the lot. It was odd. Ravens Hollow wasn't exactly a secret, but it wasn't a hot spot either. I'd expected maybe a few more cars, especially on a fall weekend. Still, the quiet suited us fine. We grabbed our packs, locked the Jeep, and started down the trail, the crunch of wet gravel fading into the soft thud of dirt under our boots. The hike-in was uneventful but grueling, mostly uphill, with slick roots and rocks hidden under a carpet of fallen leaves. The rain picked up, drumming against our hoods, and the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees looming like silent sentinels. We talked a little at first, about work, about maybe getting a dog, but as the trail steepened, we saved our breath for the climb. It took us nearly 3 hours to reach the campsite, a small clearing perched on a ridge with a stunning view of the valley below, now shrouded in mist. The first thing we noticed was a tent already pitched near the center of the clearing. It was a faded green thing, sagging under the weight of the rain, with a couple of empty beer cans scattered nearby. "Looks like someone beat us to it," I said, setting my pack down. Emily frowned, glancing around. "They're not here, though. Maybe they're out exploring." It made sense. Plenty of campers left their gear to hike nearby trails. We picked a spot on the far side of the clearing, near a cluster of pines, and started setting up our own tent, a sturdy 2-person REI model we'd splurged on last year. The rain made it slow going, but we managed, crawling inside to dry off and dig into some trail mix while we waited for the weather to ease. About an hour later, as the drizzle tapered off, we heard voices, low and muffled, carried on the wind. I unzipped the tent flap and poked my head out, expecting to see the tent's owner trudging back. Instead, I froze. 2 figures stood at the edge of the clearing, maybe 20 feet away, half hidden by the trees. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring in our direction. One was tall and lanky, wearing a soaked flannel shirt and a baseball cap pulled low. The other was shorter, stockier, in a black hoodie that clung to him like a second skin. Both had their hands in their pockets, and neither said a word. "Hey there," I called, forcing a smile. "Nice spot, huh?" They didn't respond right away. The tall one tilted his head slightly, like he was sizing me up, then stepped forward. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice flat. "Real nice." The shorter one nodded, and they shuffled closer, stopping just outside our tent. Up close, I could see their faces, pale, unshaven, with dark circles under their eyes like they hadn't slept in days. "I'm Jake," I said, gesturing to Emily, who'd poked her head out beside me. "This is Emily. You guys been here long?" "Couple days," the tall one said. "Name's Rick. That's Paul." Paul grunted, his eyes flicking between us. "You staying the night?" Rick asked. I nodded. "Just tonight, yeah. Heading back tomorrow." They exchanged a look I couldn't read. Then Rick smiled, a thin, tight-lipped thing that didn't reach his eyes. "Cool. See you around." With that, they turned and trudged back to their tent, disappearing inside without another word. Emily squeezed my arm. "That was weird," she whispered. I agreed. Something about them felt off. The way they just stood there. The way they didn't seem dressed for camping. Rick's flannel was thin, no jacket, and Paul's sneakers were caked with mud. Not exactly hiking gear. Their tent, too, was tiny. Barely big enough for one, let alone two grown men. "Maybe they're just eccentric," I said, trying to brush it off. "You know, backwoods types." But we left the tent flap cracked open anyway, keeping an eye on the clearing as the light faded. Night fell fast, the forest swallowing the last of the daylight. We didn't see Rick or Paul again, though we heard faint rustling from their tent now and then. Exhausted from the hike, we zipped up, crawled into our sleeping bags, and drifted off to the sound of rain pattering against nylon. I don't know how long I slept, maybe a few hours before I jolted awake, my bladder screaming. Grumbling, I pulled on my boots and a rain poncho, grabbed a flashlight, and slipped outside, careful not to wake Emily. The air was cold and damp, the rain a steady hiss. I stepped behind a tree a few yards from our tent, sweeping the flashlight around out of habit. That's when I heard it. Voices again, low and urgent, cutting through the downpour. I swung the beam toward the sound, my heart kicking up a notch. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. Then I glanced at Rick and Paul's tent. The flap hung open, swaying slightly, and it was empty. No sleeping bags, no gear, nothing. My stomach dropped. They'd said they were staying the night. Where the hell were they? I hurried back to our tent, shaking Emily awake. "Babe, something's wrong," I hissed, keeping my voice low. "Their tent's empty. I heard voices out there." Her eyes widened, sleep giving way to fear. "What do we do?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the voices came again, closer this time, right behind our tent. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the little multi-tool I kept in my pack. Its 2-inch blade wasn't much, but it was something, and peeked out the flap. There they were, Rick and Paul, standing just beyond the trees, motionless in the rain. Their faces were blank, eyes locked on our tent, like they'd been watching us for God knows how long. "Jake!" Emily's voice trembled. I didn't think, just acted. "Pack up now," I said, shoving our sleeping bags into our packs. "We're leaving." She didn't argue. I stepped outside, gripping the multi-tool, and shouted, "Hey, what's your deal?" No response. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. Panic clawed at me. "Emily, go!" I yelled, pointing toward the trail. She bolted and I followed, glancing back as we hit the edge of the clearing. They were still there, unmoving, watching us vanish into the dark. We ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. My lungs burned, but fear kept me going. After what felt like forever, maybe 15 minutes, we slowed to a fast walk, panting and soaked. The trail seemed endless, the forest pressing in, every snap of a twig making us jump. When we finally reached the lot, the Jeep was still there, but the pickup truck's driver's side door was now ajar, rain pooling on the seat. I didn't stop to check it, just unlocked the Jeep, threw our packs in, and peeled out, tires spinning on wet gravel. We didn't stop until we hit a 24-hour diner 30 miles away, its neon sign a beacon in the night. Shaking, we called the sheriff's office from a payphone. Cell service was non-existent out there. Deputies met us an hour later, taking our story with grim nods. They promised to check the trailhead and sent us home with a warning to stay out of the woods for a while. A week later, a deputy called. The pickup belonged to a guy named Harold Grayson. A retired logger reported missing 3 days before our trip. His wallet and keys were gone, but his camping gear matched the tent we'd seen. Footprints, 2 sets, led from the clearing into the forest, then vanished. No sign of Rick, Paul, or Harold. The deputy said they were still looking, but his tone was flat, like he didn't expect to find much. Locals, he added, had been whispering about Ravens Hollow for years. Missing hikers, strange sightings. Probably just rumor, Auntie said. But you two got lucky. Lucky. The word stuck with me, bitter and hollow. Emily and I haven't camped since. We moved closer to the city, traded the Jeep for a sedan, tried to forget, but I can't shake it. The image of those 2 men standing in the rain, their empty stares boring into me. I don't know what they wanted, what they did to Harold, or what they might have done to us. All I know is that Ravens Hollow isn't just a trail. It's a graveyard, and we barely made it out alive. I've always been fortunate to have a job that lets me travel across the U.S. In my late 20s, I worked as an IT consultant for a national firm, hopping from city to city to troubleshoot systems or train staff. Most trips were quick, 2 or 3 days max, so I rarely got to explore the places I visited. But in the fall of 2023, I landed a week-long gig in Asheville, North Carolina, a charming little town nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I wrapped up the job 2 days early, leaving me with a full day to kill before my flight out of Charlotte. For once, I had time to do something for myself. I'd always loved the outdoors, hiking, camping, anything that got me away from screens and servers. But my job kept me cooped up in offices or crammed into planes. Asheville, with its sprawling forests and crisp autumn air, seemed like the perfect chance to unwind. After some Googling, I settled on Black Pine Trail, a remote 8-hour round-trip hike about 90 minutes from my hotel. Reviews called it peaceful, off the beaten path with killer views. Exactly what I was craving. It'd be a full-day commitment, but I was all in. I woke up early, drove to a local outfitter to grab some hiking boots and a waterproof jacket. My suitcase was packed for business, not trails, and hit the road. By the time I pulled into the gravel lot at Black Pine Trail around 11 a.m., I was buzzing with excitement. The lot was empty, not a single car in sight. I'd expected a few weekend hikers given the season's peak foliage, but the solitude thrilled me. Just me, the woods, and a chance to breathe. I slung my backpack stuffed with water, energy bars, and a small flashlight over my shoulder and started down the path. The first hour was pure bliss. Towering pines stretched overhead, their needles carpeting the trail in a soft, rust-colored blanket. Golden leaves drifted down, catching the sunlight, and the faint chirping of birds mixed with the rustle of wind. It was the kind of quiet that melted away the stress of deadlines and airport security lines. But about an hour in, as the trail narrowed between 2 rows of trees, I spotted a man sitting off to the side, slumped against a trunk. He wore a faded gray hoodie, the hood pulled low over his face, and ripped jeans that looked more suited for a city alley than a forest. His head was bowed, like he was dozing, but as I got closer, he snapped it up, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach twist. I gave a quick nod, standard trail courtesy, but he didn't respond, just stared as I passed. I glanced back a few times, unease creeping in, but he stayed put. I shook it off. Probably just some eccentric local, I told myself, and kept going. 2 hours later, my legs were aching, so I found a flat rock by the trail to rest. I sat, munching an energy bar and soaking in the view, rolling hills fading into a hazy blue horizon. I'd barely finished when I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from the direction I'd come. I turned and saw him, the hoodie guy, trudging toward me, still a good 50 yards off. My pulse quickened. I stuffed my wrapper into my pack, slung it on, and started walking again, hoping to avoid him. But minutes later, the footsteps grew louder, faster, heavier, like someone running. I spun around. He was jogging straight at me, face still shadowed under that hood, hands buried in his pockets. I stepped aside, thinking he'd pass, but he skidded to a stop right in front of me, close enough that I could smell the damp earth clinging to him. "Hey," he rasped, voice rough like he hadn't spoken in days. "You drop this." He pulled a hand from his pocket and thrust out a worn black leather wallet. I frowned, confused. "That's not mine," I said, keeping my tone steady. It looked ancient, edges frayed, leather cracked, and obviously empty. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "I saw you drop it. Take it." His words were sharp now, almost a demand. I took a step back. "I didn't bring a wallet. You've got the wrong person." But he leaned closer, shoving it toward me. "Take it," he growled. His stare was unhinged, like he was daring me to argue. I didn't know what his game was. Robbery, some weird scam, or something worse. But I could feel the threat in his posture. Against my better judgment, I reached out, fingers trembling as I took the wallet from his grimy hand. It felt cold, heavier than it should have. He grinned, a crooked, hollow smile, muttered, "Good choice," and turned, walking off down the trail until he vanished around a bend. I stood there, heart pounding, clutching the thing. It was beat up, scratched, and when I flipped it open, it was as empty as I'd thought. No cash, no cards, nothing. But inside one pocket, I noticed faint, jagged marks, like someone had clawed at it with their nails. A chill ran through me. I shoved it into my backpack, suddenly desperate to get out of there. It was 3 p.m., with over 4 hours back to the car. I tried to focus on the hike, the crunch of leaves, the fading light, but my mind kept replaying that encounter. What did he want? Why force me to take it? The return trip felt endless. The forest grew eerily still. No birds, no wind, just my footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig that made me whip around, expecting to see him trailing me. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail, I was a wreck. Finally, I spotted my rental SUV in the lot, its silver paint glinting faintly in the dusk. Relief washed over me until I got closer. A shadow stretched across the gravel, spilling from behind the car, sharp and human-shaped, like someone was crouching there, waiting. I froze, staring at it. The shadow didn't move, but I knew it was him. My instincts screamed to run, but out here he'd catch me. Confronting him head-on wasn't an option either. He could be armed, unhinged, anything. My hand slipped into my pocket, fingers closing around my key fob. I edged toward the passenger side, hit the unlock button, and dove in, slamming the lock just as he sprang up from behind the car. He lunged for the driver's door, yanking the handle as I scrambled over the console. "Give it back," he roared, pounding the window with his fist. I fumbled the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life as his face, wild, furious, pressed against the glass. I threw the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel, and peeled onto the highway, watching in the rear view as he sprinted after me for a few yards before darting into the trees. I didn't stop shaking until I hit a gas station 20 miles down the road, its fluorescent lights a lifeline in the dark. I stumbled inside, found a payphone. Cell service was spotty out here, and called the county sheriff. A deputy met me there, took the wallet, and listened to my story with a frown. I drove back to the hotel exhausted and spent the night replaying it all to a friend over the phone. The next day, I got a call from the sheriff's office. The wallet belonged to a hiker named Daniel Reese, reported missing 3 weeks earlier after heading to Black Pine Trail. His car had been found abandoned 10 miles away, stripped of valuables. They'd found no trace of him, or the man in the hoodie. The deputy said they'd investigate, but his tone was skeptical, like I'd stumbled into some local ghost story. "Folks around here talk about that trail," he added. "Say it's got a way of keeping people." I didn't press him. I didn't want to know. I flew home, swore off solo hikes, and started carrying a pocket knife everywhere. That wallet, though, what was it? A trophy? A trap? I'll never know, but I see that man's grin in my nightmares. And I wonder if Daniel Reese saw it too, right before the forest swallowed him whole. Late October has always been my favorite time to hit the trails. The air is cool but not biting. The leaves turn the woods into a patchwork of red and gold, and there's a crispness that makes every step feel alive. I live in Boulder, Colorado, surrounded by some of the best hiking country in the U.S., and I've got a tight-knit crew I usually hike with: Jake, Sarah, and Mike. But their schedules are a mess. Jake's a bartender, Sarah's a nurse, and Mike's freelancing as a graphic designer. Getting us all free on the same day is like herding cats, so I've gotten used to doing shorter solo treks when I need to clear my head. There's something about the silence of the mountains that resets me. Last year, I had a rare 3-day weekend, so I decided to tackle something bigger. A 2-day loop called the Lost Creek Trail, about an hour's drive from home in Roosevelt National Forest. I'd done it once before with the gang a few years back and loved it. The way it winds through open meadows, then climbs into dense pine forests, circling back to the start. It's a solid 20-mile haul, perfect for an overnight camp. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, and a beat-up paperback, into my old Tacoma and headed out early Saturday morning, the sky still streaked with dawn pinks and purples. By 8 a.m., I was pulling into the trailhead lot, a dusty patch of gravel with a faded signboard. Mine was the only truck there, which surprised me a little. Weekends usually draw a few locals, but I shrugged it off. More peace for me. The first stretch was easy, a gentle ramble through knee-high grass dotted with wildflowers, the Rockies looming in the distance. By noon, the trail dipped into the forest, the air cooling as pines closed in overhead. I was maybe 6 miles in, humming some half-remembered tune, when I spotted a figure up ahead. At first, I couldn't tell if they were coming or going. The trees played tricks with the light. But as I closed the gap, I saw he was walking toward me. He was tall, lanky, dressed in a faded denim jacket and cargo pants. No hat, no pack. That struck me as odd. I was hours into a remote trail. Most people this far out at least carried water. He raised a hand as he got closer, a casual wave. I nodded back, keeping my distance. Solo hiking makes you cautious, even if you don't want to admit it. Up close, his face was weathered, unshaven, with deep-set eyes that lingered on me a beat too long. "Hey," he said, voice low and gravelly. "Where's your crew?" The question caught me off guard. My stomach tightened. Did he know I usually hiked with friends? Was he fishing to see if I was alone? I forced a smile, gripping my trekking poles a little harder. "Oh, they're lagging behind," I lied. "Couple minutes back. Should be here soon." He tilted his head, studying me, then grinned, a thin, crooked thing. "Good to know," he said, and kept walking past me, his boots scuffing the dirt. I waited till he was out of sight before moving on, my heart thudding louder than I'd like to admit. It was a nothing exchange, but something about it gnawed at me. His empty hands, that weird question, the way he'd looked at me like he was sizing me up. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the trail as it climbed higher, the forest thickening around me. A few hours later, with the sun dipping low, I decided to play it safe and camp off-trail. I veered half a mile west, picking my way through underbrush until I found a flat clearing ringed by pines. It felt hidden, secure. I pitched my one-man tent, brewed some instant coffee on my stove, and sat against a log, watching the sky turn orange then bruise purple. The guy faded from my mind as I ate a foil-pack meal, chicken teriyaki, my go-to, and crawled into my tent, zipping it shut against the chill. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay there staring at the nylon ceiling, the forest's night sounds filtering in, crickets, an owl, the rustle of leaves. Then maybe an hour in, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the pine needles behind my tent. My breath caught. I told myself it was a deer, a raccoon, anything but what my gut screamed. But the rhythm was too steady, too human. They got closer, 20 feet, maybe 15, then stopped dead. Silence. My pulse hammered in my ears. I clutched my multi-tool, its tiny blade a flimsy comfort, and waited, barely breathing. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. No more steps, no retreat. Just that heavy, invisible presence lurking out there. Dawn finally crept in, gray light seeping through the trees. I hadn't slept, my eyes gritty, my nerves shot. I couldn't stay put, I had to move. I unzipped the tent flap an inch, peering out. Nothing but trees and mist. I climbed out, scanning the clearing, every snap of a twig making me flinch. The forest was still, too still. I broke camp fast, stuffing my gear into my pack with shaking hands. That's when I saw them, footprints in the soft dirt, just beyond a tree 10 feet from my tent. Big, deep impressions, boots, not hooves. They trailed off into the woods, but I didn't follow. Panic clawed up my throat. I slung my pack on and bolted for the trail, half running, half stumbling over roots and rocks. Back on the path, I turned toward the lot, not the loop's end. Screw finishing it, I just wanted out. The guy had been ahead of me yesterday. If he doubled back, he could be anywhere. Every shadow felt like him, every gust of wind his breath. It was a brutal 6-hour trek back, my legs burning, my mind racing. I kept picturing those footprints, imagining him standing there all night, watching me sleep. By late afternoon, the lot came into view, my truck still alone under a sky turning gold. I unlocked it, jumped in, and peeled out, gravel pinging off the undercarriage. I called Jake that night from my apartment, voice shaky as I spilled the story. He said I'd dodged a bullet, maybe a drifter, maybe worse. Sarah and Mike agreed when we met up later. They'd heard whispers about Lost Creek, old tales of hikers vanishing in the 80s, chalked up to bears or bad luck. I reported it to the Forest Service, but they brushed it off. Too vague, no proof beyond my word and some prints. The ranger I spoke to did say offhand that they'd found an abandoned campsite a month back. No owner, just a sleeping bag and a half-eaten MRE. It didn't help my nerves. I still hike, but never solo anymore. Groups mandatory now. I upgraded my multi-tool to a real knife too, though I hope I never need it. That man's face, those eyes, that grin, sticks with me, a ghost in my memory. What did he want? Was he just messing with me or waiting for something more? I don't know and I don't want to. Lost Creek's off my list for good.